Hey everybody, Mr. Murphy here. I'm going to talk to you about 6.3, which is about fermentation. Don't you hate when you forget to breathe? I do. Did you ever stop to think, why do I breathe? I'm sure that's a question that has kept you up many nights throughout your life, and I'm happy to be here to help you to understand. Something I had not mentioned on the last section, when we looked at the electron transport chain, all these electrons are getting dropped off by NADH and FADH2, and that's powering the movement of protons, which lets ATP synthase do its thing. We get all this ATP. Awesome. Where do the electrons go? It turns out that's the whole entire reason why we breathe. We breathe so that we can have abundance of oxygen inside our inner mitochondrial matrix. So that way, when these electrons are done, or these electrons have used up all their excited energy, and they need somewhere to go, the oxygen scoops them up, along with the protons from down here, and it produces water. Now, that's it. That's why we breathe. We breathe so that we have an acceptor for the electrons in the electron transport chain. This section's all about what if we don't breathe? Or what if we're not an organism that breathes at all? Or what if we're an organism that just simply exists in the absence of oxygen? And that's where the process of fermentation comes in. You can think of fermentation as essentially being a mechanism to allow an organism to sort of limp by on very little amounts of ATP. Because we saw in the process of glycolysis, we produce 2 ATP. Everything after glycolysis is all about powering up NADH, FADH2, these energy carriers that are needed for the electron transport chain, but the electron transport chain requires oxygen. And so when we don't have oxygen, we don't have the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. We don't have the electron transport chain, and we're left only with glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis yields 2 ATP. But glycolysis also makes 2-pyruvate. And it turns out that too much pyruvate kind of becomes a problem. Too much of anything inside of the cell becomes a problem. It hinders the continued production of that molecule. As you get higher and higher concentrations of it, it becomes chemically less and less favorable to keep making it. And so this is what fermentation steps in and does. And what fermentation does, there's 2 different types of fermentation we'll talk about, but it takes the pyruvate and converts it to something that we can get rid of. And by continuously getting rid of it, we can keep making more pyruvate, and we can keep getting that 2 ATP. And so when you're running on some crazy race and you're getting super out of breath and really pushing yourself to the limit, and you start feeling that muscle burn, what's happening, or maybe you feel that afterwards, but what's happening is you've pushed yourself so far that your body, yes, it's still doing the full respiration. It's not like you run too far and then respiration stops. It's just that you're pushing yourself so hard that you are producing all the ATP you can through the whole electron transport chain thing, and you still are producing more through this process of fermentation. And you're by doing that, producing this product called lactic acid. And lactic acid is what produces that sort of burning sensation in your muscles. And it tells you that you have pushed yourself basically to your limits, to the limits that your oxygen supply and your breathing rate and just your body can possibly stand. Because at that point, what your body is doing is it's engaging in fermentation and converting the pyruvate and the NADH that's produced in glycolysis into lactic acid, which restores the NAD plus and allows it to go back to glycolysis and continue the process. Otherwise, we would run out of the things we need in order to continue the process. And so here you can see a diagram of this where, okay, we take glucose, we make pyruvate, we don't have anywhere to send pyruvate because Krebs cycle is not working, our mitochondria are shut down or gone or working as hard as they can. And so now we need to basically restore our ability to do glycolysis. So to do that, we get rid of the pyruvate. And in doing so, we basically burn some of the energy from the NADH, and we send back the NAD plus so we can keep doing this. And the net result is that we're getting these 2 ATP each time, but we're producing a byproduct. And it's a byproduct that, at least for humans, we're not super well adapted to being able to handle. We can't just endlessly produce lactic acid. It does cause problems, such as the pain you experience, but it's better than just having the whole thing shut down and stop supplying the energy you might need. If you are in a circumstance where you're running from bears or something. Alcoholic fermentation, it's not school appropriate. Different types of bacteria and things do this basically same process, but in so doing, they convert that pyruvate into ultimately ethanol, which restores the NAD to allow them to continue doing glycolysis. And so yeast and bacteria and different organisms can basically be denied oxygen, kept in a stored container, and not allowed to undergo the full process of respiration, and instead rely solely upon glycolysis to get the ATP that they need, but then they produce ethanol. So they're producing this alcohol molecule as a byproduct of that. Very similar, really identical to ultimately the goal of what lactic acid fermentation is in our muscle cells. And here you can see the same thing with some extra steps where that NADH is just used up and sort of wasted to produce the NAD again. But the net result is that each glucose molecule yields 2 ATP. That's fermentation. If you have questions, let me know.